Let's see how we can use our knowledge about what those quadrantal angles and the images of 30, 60, and 45-degree angles look like in order to draw other angles. So we have 315 degrees, 135 degrees with a negative sign, and 855 degrees. Now there are a number of different ways to do this. I'll show you what I think is easiest. The first thing I advise is if your angle is negative, so less than 0, work with the positive version first. And then at the end, you'll just reflect everything you have done, and we'll talk a bit more when we get to part B, but I wanted to mention it now. So if the angle is less than 0, we'll work with the positive version, and at the end, reflect it. And I put reflect in quotations because, well, we'll see exactly what I mean by reflect in part B, and maybe an additional example afterwards. But in part A, our angle is not less than 0, so we don't have to worry about that. After you do this, then I advise taking your angle, and if it's bigger than 360 degrees, subtracting 360 degrees as many times as you need to end up with an angle between 360 and 0 degrees. So you'll subtract 360 degrees as many times as necessary. Until the angle is between 0 and 360. Of course, we don't have to do that this particular step on this problem because, well, 315 degrees is already between 0 and 360 degrees. Do make sure, if you have to do this step, that you write down how many times you had to subtract 360 degrees. Okay. Likely you see that this step is something we'll have to do for part C here. But for part A, we don't have to do either of these steps. For part A, we can start with the third step, which is simply asking ourselves what quadrant does 315 degrees lie in? If it's between 0 and 90 degrees, we know it's in the first quadrant. If it's between 90 and 180 degrees, it's in the second quadrant. If it's between 180 and 270, it's in the third. And if it's between 270 and 360, it's in the fourth. And the reasoning for this, of course, is we know what the so-called quadrantal angles look like. So an angle that's going to fall between, or in quadrant 1, so somewhere over here, is going to be between 0 and 90 degrees. An angle in quadrant 2 is going to be between 90 degrees and 180 degrees. And of course an angle in quadrant 3, that's going to be between 180 and 270 because that angle is 180 and the negative y-axis is 270, and then finally between 270 and 360 will give you an angle, or an angle between 270 and 360 will be an angle that's in quadrant 4. So what quadrant does 315 lie in? I suppose that's a question mark. Well, it's between 270 and 360, so the answer is quadrant 4. So now we know that our picture is going to be some angle that's in quadrant 4. We'll go ahead and draw our initial side here. See if we can't do better than that. There we go. And we are in quadrant 4. Notice that I went counterclockwise because my angle, 315 degrees, is positive, and that indicates a counterclockwise angle. And finally, I'm going to finish by drawing a terminal side in quadrant 4, but should I draw it like this, or perhaps like this, or perhaps like this? Well, in order to answer that question, we can ask ourselves how much larger or smaller is 315 degrees than a quadrantal angle, excuse me. So we'll ask how much larger or smaller, either one will work. How much larger or smaller is 315 degrees than a quadrantal angle? So you could ask yourself in this case, how much smaller is 315 degrees than 360 degrees, or how much larger is 315 degrees than 270 degrees? Let's take a look at a few hypotheticals here. So if we concluded that some angle that we are working on for some different problem, let's say, so some angle is 60 degrees larger than 270 degrees, then the way that I would draw that is, remember, 60 degrees, that's 2/3 of 90 degrees. So the angle would look something like, well, you would draw your terminal side here, and you would draw your angle pretty close to 360 degrees because this measurement here is 60. This angle is 60 degrees more than 270 degrees. Whereas if it were something like 45 degrees more than 270 degrees, then it would be halfway between 270 degrees and 360 degrees. And finally, if it were something like 30 degrees more than 270 degrees, well, it would only be a little bit larger than 270 degrees. And now back to the problem that I'm currently working. My 315 degrees is how much larger than 270 degrees? Well, if you do 315 minus 270, you get 45 degrees. So this is 45 degrees larger than 270 degrees. And so my terminal side, I'm going to draw halfway between 270 and 360. So it looks something like this. To reiterate, when you make the conclusion that 315 degrees is 45 degrees larger than 270 degrees, then the important characteristic that your drawing should have is that this should look like a 45-degree angle, which 45-degree angles are halfway between 0 and 90 degrees.